The wind off the wall tasted of old metal and buried bones. It gnawed through wool and boiled leather and found the seams beneath John's gorget, insisting, relentless, like truth you'd rather not hold. Lanterns burned low along the walkway, their light cast down across scalloped ice where the wooden hoardings creaked in their sleep. Far below, the yard of Castle Black lay muffled in snow, as if the gods themselves had raked their fingers through it. Even the ravens felt the cold. They huddled in a black knot, feathers fluffed, eyes glittering like wet beads. John had written until his wrist ached, until the ink froze and had to be warmed between his palms. The letters were blunt and without ornament, as plain as the sky. In the rookery's dim glow, he told lords who would not listen, and fisherwives who could not read, and sellswords who would sniff out coin like dogs in a slaughterhouse. There is a mountain of dragonglass on Dragonstone, and it kills others as surely as fire kills whites. Dig it, ship it, arm your men, your small folk, your children if you must. The wall will not spare you when the cold walks. He had told them one thing more, because words without a name were like iron without edge. He had signed with a hand steadier than he felt. Jon Snow, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. Fewer lies than most letters, Davos Seaworth said, stamping his feet on the walkway until ice splintered beneath his boots. But fewer courtesies, too. I don't have time for courtesies, Jon said. His breath smoked. He could see the tower of the Lord Commander in the moonlight, a shape as stubborn as a knuckle. Stannis' sorceress had taken to standing on its roof and praying, her hair thrashing about like a red banner in a gale. You said Stannis left Dragonstone poorly garrisoned. Aye, Davos said. We'd more ships than men when we sailed north. Dragonstone's an old, hot island with cold stones and colder hulls. But there's gentry enough to take a gift if it's laid out for them. And there's fishermen enough to sell their backs and their sons' backs for a promise of coin. Sell their backs, Jon said, tasting the words. I don't want it bought with lies coin. Davos snorted. Then pay in truth. There's folks you'll never move with pretties. But put a blade in their hand that'll keep their bairn breathing, and they'll pile the world's black glass into your hold quick as you please. The last letter slipped from Jon's fingers and into a wicker basket. When he lifted his lantern, light beat against the varnished feathers of a dozen birds already hooded and waiting. Samwell Tarly stood behind him, ink-stained and blinking through sleep-sore eyes, a scarf looped clumsily over his nose. Gilly, with the babe cuddled against her breast, hovered in the doorway. I found more, Sam said, in Maester Eamon's old papers, an account from a brother who traveled beyond the wall in the time of the old king. He mentions the first men napping obsidian into blades. The children, he writes that the children taught them. There was a line. Keep it, Jon said gently. Tell me again in the morning. I mean, I can tell you now, Sam said, abashed. If you need it now, I will need it every day, Jon said. But I need you to sleep tonight. He lifted the wicker basket and opened the rookery's shutters. The cold bit deeper, a thin knife pressed between ribs. The ravens stirred, a dry, papery sound. Below, the world fell away. 1,000 feet of sheer ice, the haunted wood laid out like a field of bristles, and beyond that the world Jon had sworn to keep at bay. Ravens carried words. They did not carry hope. But words were a kind of lever, and with a long enough lever, even a mountain might be moved. Jon set his lantern ring on the hook by the window and began tying thin cords to thin legs, letter to letter, bird to bird. When he was finished, he stood a moment with a palm on the nearest raven's back. The bird craned its head and bit him, lightly, for a raven. It was hungry. They were always hungry. So am I, Jon said. Davos took the basket from him, and together they flung the birds into the night. The ravens vanished so swiftly that Jon could imagine they'd been snatched by the wind. Nothing remained but the hush of snow falling, that slow hiss like breath taken and never let go. On the yard, men labored by torchlight to load barrels and sacks onto trestles. Eastwatch had sent a wagon with iron fittings coarse enough to have been hammered by a blind man. The axles screamed as they turned. Flame licked at pitch, a mule brayed, Ed Tollett's dry voice drifted up from the gate as he lectured a boy on the many ways a fool could die in a yard filled with men and fire. "You won't stop after we send the letters," Davos said. It wasn't a question. "No," John said. "You'll do more. I will make it so none can claim they did not know," John said. "And then I will make it so none can say they did not have a blade." Davos rubbed the stubble along his jaw. "You'll board a ship with me, then, if Stannis gives leave." He spat a little, a habit he had learned in worse places. "He will give leave." As if conjured by his name, the king appeared below them, cloak snapping like a sail. Stannis kept his chin in the air against the cold. Melisandre followed at his shoulder, and in her wake men carried a small chest wrapped in oilcloth. The Red Woman's eyes found the rookery window with the unerring instinct of a hawk's. She lifted her hands, and for a heartbeat the torches flared higher, as if called. Davos swore softly and tipped his head as a sailor might to a wave that could drown him. "Lord Commander," Stannis called up, voice flat and carrying. "Come down." He did. Melisandre's smile was as narrow as a blade. "You send letters like sparks," she said when he stood before her. "In darkness, sparks are as banners." "I'm sending truths," John said. "Truths catch fire as quick as lies," she said. "And burn. Longer. You were wise to call the black glass by its older name. Dragonglass. Frozen fire." She placed a hand over her own bones, where her heart must live. "Lawler favors fire of any kind." "And the men who throw it?" John asked. She tilted her head. "Better than those who freeze." Stannis cut the talk with a glance that would have cowed granite. "We sail Davos to Dragonstone. You have men to spare." "I have men I can send," John said. "And I must send more. The wildlings at Hardhome." "The wildlings at Hardhome are not our concern," Stannis said, even as his mouth tightened. Duty warred with need on his face. "We march on Winterfell when we can march. But I will have Davos bring you your glass. I will have it known that Stannis Baratheon gave you that gift." "I will have it known," John said. "And I will have it used." "It will be," Davos said. He clasped John's forearm. "If there were more of me, I'd send them all, but you'll have this one as long as he lives." Melisandre's eyes narrowed. "Men do not have one life," she murmured. "Not truly." "Spare me," Davos said dryly. "Save your favor for the wind. We'll need it." She drew back, unoffended. "You'll have some," she said. "What you give to the fire returns." "Then give it a prayer," Davos said, and turned to the men with the chest. "That for me." It was. When the oilcloth came away, the chest's lid rose on a breath steeped in smoke and spice. Within, the facets of old, napped glass caught the torchlight and fed it back in dim, stubborn stars. Some of the blades were near as old as the wall, edges sharp as rumor. Others had been chipped by Night's Watch hands in leaner months, when a brother needed a charm as much as a dagger. Davos took one into his hand, weighing it. "Brittle as a lord's promise," he said, and his grin flashed. "But it'll do the work." "It shatters them," John said. "I have seen it." Davos placed the blade back and signaled for the chest to be closed. "Then let us shatter them by the thousand. Men say the sea is a highway, but in winter it is a maze, and in the bite a bad-tempered one." The first ships sailed within a fortnight, 3 stout cogs from White Harbor with their bellies full of salted fish, wool, and the hope of return cargo. Lord Wyman Manderley did not travel with them. There were feasts to attend and accounting to weigh, but his sigil flew from the masts, and that was enough to turn fishermen into privateers and tradesmen into fleets. Davos's Black Betha cut through the chop with the self-importance of a lady who knew her worth, and at her stern the Onion Knight stood and let the spray beat his face until it stung. Dragonstone rose from the sea like something the sea had been forced to accept. A fortress of basalt and buttress, stairs carved into cliffs that had been molten once, the skin of the island broken with veins of glass that looked like obsidian rivers frozen mid-course. The sky above it was bluer than it had any right to be. Gulls scrawled letters across it with their wings. The castle's black dragons took no notice, their stone eyes fixed on wars long ended and not yet begun. Davos knelt on and a napper, old as marl, who'd come from the mountains of the Vale with a bag of flints and a dead wife's shoes and a past he did not mention. Davos put coin where coin would do, promises where promises would hold, and stubbornness where nothing else mattered. He walked the cliffs with the napper and watched the man pick glass from vent and seem as if it had always been meant for his fingers. "Same as flint," the napper muttered, working a blade against the heel of his hand. "Different song, same dance." "See," he struck. Flakes came away in thin, translucent leaves, edges singing. "You push, you don't force." "I've forced many a thing," Davos said. "Not one of them was happy for it afterward." The napper snorted. "You're that onion lord." "I'm that onion lord," Davos said, resigned and pleased. "And I'm not leaving until your song's been taught to half the island." There were not enough hands, so Davos found more. The barges came and went. Some to Eastwatch, some to White Harbor, some up the narrow sea to Gulltown's quiet court where bronze helms gleamed and old men measured time by snowfall. In White Harbor, Lord Manderley turned his bulk and his bakeries to the matter. He fed half the city for free to keep men's hands napping, and in return their hands made a forest of arrowheads and spearheads that glimmered like black snow when laid out on a table. Sailmakers stitched unfamiliar lengths for cargo they did not know. Carvers fitted sockets into ash wood and yew. Sailors swore that the island moaned in the night when they cut into its veins. The napper rolled his eyes and kept working. "Let it moan," he said. "It had this stuff a long time. Now it's going to be used." Ravens went out from Dragonstone too. Davos wrote some, though he had never learned to love letters the way Shireen had. He wrote to lords, to Wyman Manderley, to Bronze Yohn Royce, to the Glover and Mormont and Karstark, though that letter he addressed and sealed with a grimace. He wrote to women who held keeps while their husbands fought, and to boys who were yet men. He wrote to sell shops and smithies, and to one glassblower in Old Town who answered with a page of questions about obsidian's tempering that meant nothing at all to Davos but made the napper snort with appreciation. When a ship outbound from the narrow sea went down in a squall, the men of Blacktide raided her flotsam near Fair Isle and found a crate of arrowheads that cut them when they reached inside, as if the crate had grown teeth. One islander carried a length of glass in his palm to the Kingsmoot, and Euron Greyjoy took it and turned it in his fingers with a smile as narrow as a whalebone comb. "What is that?" Asha called over the roar. "A toy," Euron said, and slid it into his belt. But later, when the fire burned lower and the brine-soaked wind wrapped knives in its hem, he pulled the shard out and held it up to the moon. His crew said it drank the light. He slept with it under his pillow and woke with a headache he could not shake, the whisper of ice just behind his ear. In the Vale, Lord Yohn Royce read Jon's letter and thumped the head of his staff on the floor. "I believe the boy," he said. On the dais, Robin Arryn shrunk back into his seat, restless, small. Littlefinger's smile did not reach his eyes. "Believing and moving are different things," he murmured. "In the Vale we make them the same," Lord Yohn said, and his men gathered nappers of their own from the foothills, and traded wool for glass, and prepared to send a wing of mounted men north along the high road. Sansa read Jon's letter in a room with a good fire and a window that faced the mountains, and for the first time in months something in her unclenched. The words were so like him, stubborn and plain, leeched of court and cunning, and so unlike the world that had haunted her. She held the seal to the flame until the wax softened and bled into her palm like a drop of heart's blood. "We will go north," she said to the man who had taught her how to hold a knife when you did not want your hand to look like it was holding one. "The Vale is a delicate bird," Littlefinger murmured at her shoulder. "If you look at it too hard it dies." "Then we will not look," Sansa said, voice thin and hard. "We will fly." In King's Landing, Cersei held Jon's letter at arm's length, as if it carried a smell. Qyburn took it from her in both hands and read slowly, each word tasting like a grape he considered and did not spit out. "Obsidian," he said. "They call it dragonglass, but the maesters call it obsidian. Volcanic glass. It is brittle, but—" He tilted his head. "The stories. One might test." Cersei's lip curled. "Test it on what?" "We have meat in the black cells," Qyburn said, gentle. And we have rats. Rats are poor test subjects. They are stubborn to control, and they sleep at inconvenient times. Cersei turned and looked out over a city that swelled and ate and made noises like a living thing grown too big for its own skin. Send a ship, she said finally. Make it look like I'm generous. Bring back what you need to test. And if it does what they say, her voice sharpened, send more ships. It will cost, Qyburn said. Then we will spend, she said. We spend on things that keep us alive. The rest is for songs. Davos returned to the wall on a wind that hissed like a word he would rather not repeat. He went ashore at Eastwatch, where the sea wore the world like a glove. He found Jon in the yard, where barrels had become mountains and men had learned to stack them with their eyes closed. The chest of knives had multiplied 100-fold. A wagon creaked beneath their weight, and 2 wildling boys, wasp-thin and freckled, sat on its tail, legs swinging, the knives black behind them like a night sky. Look at you, Davos said, grinning, and the grin fell off his mouth when he saw Jon's face. There was a bruise like spilled ink along his jaw and a thin cut near his eye. We quarreled, Jon said simply. With whom? With men who have buried brothers and would not see wildlings on this side of the wall, Jon said. Some would kill me for opening the gate to the wrong men. Others would kill me for closing it to the right ones. Do I have to guess which is which? Davos asked. You do, Jon said, but his mouth softened. Some of them are too frightened to tell the difference. I will not let them decide for me. Good, Davos said, because if you do, we all die. The messages had trickled back like rain, then like snowmelt, then like a flood. Some were stamped with seals old as families. Others were crude marks. A fish, a wheel, a hand with 3 fingers. Lord Manderley had opened his stores to the purpose, and his fast galleys now wore black glass tucked into their bellies as if they carried seabirds' eggs. House Glover would send men. House Mormont would send a daughter who spoke more plainly than any man 10 times her age, and behind her the stubborn handful of warriors bare island bred like oak saplings. House Karstark's return raven was thin and careful, but the bundle tied to its leg was heavy as sin with knives. From the Vale came Royce's promise of riders on the high road and a pouch of knap spearheads so beautifully chipped that even Jon, who did not understand such things, felt their rightness. They will come, Jon told the men huddled in the frosted common hall. And they will go again. They will arm and go south and arm and go west. They will not hold the wall, and that is as it must be. We need them alive in their keeps if the cold gets south of us. This, he lifted a blade so black it swallowed the firelight, doesn't work from the ground if the arm that holds it is in a grave. Tormund Giantsbane spat mead onto the floor and wiped his mouth with a hand as broad as a spade. You talk too much and not enough, he said. When do we go to Hardhome and bring my people out? 2 weeks, Jon said. Faster if wind favors. We could do it now, Tormund growled, but there was patience in his eyes now where once there had been only rage. He had watched men die for words and seen that some words were worth it. We bring them, we arm them. We stand. We stand, Jon said. He did not sleep much then. The days were thin and the wind cut and the work did not stop. He crossed men off lists and wrote new lists beneath, and considered the yards of fletching that would be needed and the length of pikes that could hold a wight at bay without snapping. He sent Gilly with a crate to the kitchens and told the cooks to bake bread until their arms ached and their eyes burned and not stop until he said. He drank what wine they had like a man who wanted something more and could not say it. He walked the wall and the yard and the halls and the rooms he had outgrown when he was a boy with a bastard's hunger. He spoke to ghosts the way other men spoke to God, with honesty that hurt. At dawn, with frost stiff in his beard, he and Tormund led the first convoy out of Eastwatch. The ships were a patchwork. Black Betha with her proud old lines, white harbor cogs with round bellies, fishing boats so narrow they looked like knives themselves, a squat galley from Gulltown with a captain who had been to Bravos and pretended that made him a kind of prince, and 3 longboats of wildlings whose names, translated, came out like insults. Behind them, sea rime clung to ropes and men's brows, and above them the sky held itself in a thin, stubborn blue. Hardhome was a word that soured the mouth, even among those who had never seen it. When they made it to the bay under a sky shot with veining cloud, John could taste why. The place had been a city once, in the way wildlings make cities. Hides stretched over frames, long halls of wood with driftwood ribs bleaching in the sun, smoke rising in thin threads from holes cut through roofs. Now it was a broken bowl, half of it pulled away by the sea, hems ripped where the cliffs had given loose. A cold burned there that was not of wind. They came into the cove under oars and silence, black glass stowed low and men's faces drawn pale. Tormund stood at the prow, beard stiff with frost, eyes set. The first shout came off the shingle, ragged and hard to place, and then bodies appeared, thin shadows becoming men and women and children. They were so many. John had known there were so many, and yet he had not known. It shook him. The air shook with their need. "We'll take as many as we can," he said, and hated himself the moment the words left his mouth. "We'll take as many as we can," Tormund echoed without hate, and then he cupped his hands around his mouth and bellowed, "Move, you sorry bits of seal shite, move. The sea doesn't wait for your bellies. Boats there, women and bairns. Men." He looked to John. John looked to the north. "Men," John said. "Line, spear points, then bows, then fire." He had planned, and still the planning felt like catching smoke in cupped hands. But obsidian made a sound when you struck it, and he had learned to hear that sound. He had learned to trust that something was there when he could not see it. They set a ring of spearmen beyond a rough palisade of driftwood. Obsidian heads fletched to ash. Behind them stood archers, their arrow buckets half full of black and half of old goosefeather iron. Behind them, neat piles of firewood and pits filled with pitched straw and oil waited for a spark. Davos found the fire pots and cursed the way only a sailor could curse, and then set a crew to stoving them open. "Not till I say," he told the boys, voice suddenly very calm. Tormund waded into the crowd like a man into surf, parting it with his voice, pulling old men and skinny children and women heavy with child toward boats as if he would lift them all if he could. John, sword on his back, took the ring of spears with Ed and the men he trusted, and they held it open like a mouth. "It won't be enough," Ed said. "It never is," John said. The cold came down then, not from the wind but as if the light itself had grown brittle. On the ridge above the cove, shapes appeared, thin as men seen through rain. They carried no torches and the light didn't want them. A hush rippled through the beach. Men who had been crying out for their children forgot their children and stared. "Get those javelins ready," John said to the boys he had given javelins to. They were too young. Everyone was too young. "When you see their eyes throw, not before. You'll see the eyes. They'll be blue." His voice did not shake. He thought of Bran under the old gods, of Lyanna Mormont speaking words like stones dropped in a pool, of Sansa's letter tucked inside his shirt where he had sewn it like a fool. He thought of Stannis' face and Melisandre's otherworld eyes and made himself a promise he hoped was not a lie. "We will get them aboard." The first White Walker came into sight over a spur of broken rock. It moved with a kind of unhurry that set John's teeth on edge. It was thin as old ice, and what armor it wore was like frost. It stepped lightly, as if the world had been made to carry it. Behind it, white spilled. A dozen, then a dozen more, an army of bone and rag driven forward by a will that was colder than a blade in the gut. They made no sound beyond the crunching of their feet and the wet slither of things that used to be men. "Eyes," John said. "Blue eyes." They came down the slope at them in a long, slow tide, and then the tide broke. Javelins took the first two walkers, obsidian points sinking into ice flesh with a thunk like biting an apple. For a heartbeat nothing changed. Then both shattered, the sound like glass thrown from a height and breaking on stone. Along the beach, 3 dozen whites collapsed as if someone had cut their strings. The cheering that went up should have been joyous. It sounded ragged and terrified. It sounded like men who realized that an enemy could die and would keep coming anyway. "Arrows," John called, "and fire when they're close." Not before. Hold until you smell them." They smelled like cold dirt and wet hair and the inside of a tomb. The whites broke against the driftwood wall, clung to it, came over it like ants. Spears took some, others came on. Swords cut and hacked, and a man could sweat even in that awful cold, his hands slipping on a grip made slick. Ed fought with the economy of a ledger book, muttering numbers, counting. 1 for this, 2 for that. Tormund fought like laughter turned to rage. Ghost tore through a knot of dead with the grace of a dancer and came away rhymed with black blood. A big woman with a scar across her mouth and a child's handprint sewn into her furs. Karsi, Tormund had named her. Shoved a boy behind her, killed 2, took a wound and did not fall. Now, Davos called, when the pitch stink grew thick enough to bite a man's eyes. Now, light the pits. The fire went up with a sullen roar. Whites threw themselves into it and blackened. Some climbed over their burning fellows and came on. A walker stepped delicately to the edge of flame and cocked its head as if considering the notion of burning, then reached out with a blade that grew frost with every breath and snicked the head from a spear that came too near. An arrow took it in the throat and it staggered, and another arrow took it in the eye and it simply was not there anymore. More whites collapsed. Men in the line sobbed out relief as if they'd been punched. They bought minutes by killing walkers. They bought more minutes with fire. They threw those minutes onto boats and pushed them off and told men who could not swim to sit still and be still and pray to whatever would have them. The sea took some because the sea always takes some. The dead took some because the dead do not bargain. The storm came with a sound like stone breaking in a cave. Snow went sideways. The sky closed. The mountain above them crumbled a little, just a little, and the little became a lot. Men and dead alike slid and tumbled, and the air tasted of stone dust and the kind of fear that leaves no room for anything else. Jon went down on a knee, came up with glass in his hand he did not remember picking up. He buried it in a chest that had been a man and would never be again. He saw a flash of ice-blue eyes and flung the glass he held into them. The eyes went out, and then he saw the one who commanded the storm. He was tall as tales. His crown was frost. The light that was not light made every edge of him clear. He looked at Jon without haste. He lifted one hand, slowly, as if to greet a king. Jon felt his own breath catch in his throat and not want to come out. Hating his own body, he inhaled as if his lungs had been filled with wet rags and started toward the God's damn thing anyway. No, Davos said, suddenly in front of him like a boy grabbing a road warden's horse by the bridle. Not you. Not now. It was enough. It was an insult. The Night King's calm turned the smallest degree. He watched Davos as one watches an insect that has landed on a goblet of wine. Behind that attention, men shoved the last of the boats off, burying them with bodies. Karsi cradled a little girl in her arms, her face set. Tormund bellowed ripe words that would have made a sept blower blush. Ed yanked Jon backward by the collar like a hound hauling a pup. The Night King lowered his hand, almost delicately, and the dead who had fallen into the pits began to stir. The fishers who had drowned in the cove sat up, water running from their mouths like spilled talk. The old man who had died of a good death last winter opened his eyes onto this and made a sound like a bell that has been broken and rung anyway. The boats put off. The men who had taken the boats surged them into deeper water with oars and curses. The wind and the cold tried to strip them of everything. The sea did what it could. On the beach, the Night King raised his hands a fraction and the dead stood. Men who had arrived resolute went away silent. A boy who had lost his mother made no sound at all until they were 3 miles off, and then he screamed and screamed, and no one told him to hush because they could not. When they reached Eastwatch, men dragged the boats onto the shingle and fell into the snow and did not care how cold it was. The fires seemed small and far away. The flames wept when the wind hit them. Jon stood alone for a long time, his hands open and empty. Then he walked the yard. He touched heads with his knuckles like a father might. When he came to Karsi, he put a hand on her shoulder and felt her bones move under skin too thin for anyone. "You'll have a place," he said. "Your people will have places. Not all with each other, but places. They'll need knives in those places," she said, voice raw. "And bows. And teachers. They don't know the way a wall blocks a street this side of the wall. "We'll teach them," John said. "You mean you will," she said, and managed a cracked smile. "We'll learn." The watch did not kill Jon Snow that winter. They tried in small ways. A shoulder in a hall, a muttered word that grew teeth. But when blades came out one gray morning near the yard's midden heap, Ed was already there with two men who slept like wolves and woke like them too. And Davos happened to arrive with a hand on a knife he did not make a show of. Ollie stood behind Alistair Thorne and looked like a boy whose father had told him to throw a curse at a god. When Jon took a step forward, Ollie took one back. "Not today," Ed said to the men with knives. And a raven called once, a harsh, disapproving sound, and somehow the knives did not find purchase. It might have been different if the letters had not spread. It would have been different if the people they had saved from Hardhome had had nowhere to go. But the places made for them were real. Dwellings went up in the lee of hills. Tents became huts, became houses. The phrase of the twins turned a caravan away at Spear Point and went to bed smug. That night, a cold came down the green fork and frost silvered the banners hanging in their great hall. In White Harbor, Lord Manderley put a pig into the oven and cut it from the stove to feed 24 wildling children who could not stop staring at his cook's hats. He wrote to Jon afterward with grease on the seal. "They sing badly," the note said. "But they sing. Send more knives." They sent knives. They sent them south and west and to the Vale and to the Fingers and to the Riverlands. They sent them to sea towers where men who had never seen snow brought the black glass to their faces and squinted to imagine the thing it would have to cut. They sent them to a woman in Old Town who ran a school for street children and taught them to read and to make arrowheads and shifts. Each word learned matched to one flake of glass chipped properly, so that letters and edges multiplied at the same rate. They sent them to a knight who had lost his land twice and his name once and had a boy's laugh. They sent to a house that had no lord because he'd gone to seek the gods in a tree. They sent to a ship headed for Bravos that never made it, and men along the coast found black glass arrowheads in the bellies of fish for a season, like the sea had grown teeth. Sansa rode north in a cloak the color of dusk, the Vale's air keen against her cheeks. She had learned to lower her gaze until eyes slid off her. Now she chose when to raise it. Jon Royce kept a hand always near the hilt of his sword, not because he feared attack, but because his fingers had been made for such a place and felt unused without it. Littlefinger shifted smiles in his mind as he rode, as a man might sort knives by sharpness. When they reached the neck, a wind came up that smelled of brine and old salt marsh, and beyond it lay a country that Sansa had known all her life and did not know any longer. They reached Mole's Town and found 3 of Jon's men waiting with a cart and a girl named Lyanna Mormont holding court on it like a queen on a barrel. "You finally came," the girl said. "About time." "We came as quick as we could," Sansa said, embracing her. Lyanna suffered it and then stepped back with dignity. "Will you take us to my brother?" Lyanna looked her up and down as if measuring carpentry. "I will," she said. "But don't think that helps." "Helps what?" "The way men listen," Lyanna said, and her mouth turned down. "Nobody listens until it's too late. Then they listen to anything. I think, they'll hear," Sansa said, warmth slipping into her voice despite the thinness of her smile. Lyanna sniffed. "They hear me because my men stand behind me with spears. Make your men stand behind you. Then you can say what you like." Winterfell looked smaller when she saw it again, because memory had made it enormous. Smoke rose from it, and the smoke was honest. Men slept there and ate there and burned wood because it was cold. It was held by the Boltons, and the banners flapped with their flayed men on them. Lyanna spat in the snow. "Sick," she said mildly. "Jon wants," Sansa began. "Jon wants a great many things," Lyanna said. "But he hasn't been flayed. And he wants them knives in every hand. And he wants to live. So, we do the thing that makes that most likely." They did not storm Winterfell. Other men did that later and made songs about it. They ate away at it instead, like mice at a sack of grain. They cut the lines that fed it. They sent words to houses that hated the Boltons a little more than they feared the dead and told them where to place their knives. They encouraged a man to become the kind of man he secretly wished he was, and then he did the thing they wished. They waited for snow to do what snow always did. Tire out the men who thought it was a kind of decoration you shook out over a feast. When the Bolton banners came down, they came down fast. Bastards burned quicker than linen if you put a truth to them. Sansa walked into Winterfell with her head high and her hands empty and stood in the gods' wood so that the old gods could see her. Jon met her there, and his face was thinner and older, and they stood and were quiet. There were no words that appropriated what had been spent. They let the trees say those words with their slow, sap-thick tongues. There were letters from farther south. A queen across the narrow sea had hatched dragons out of stone and flame and come to land with sails shadowing the water like wings. She brought unsullied and men who had crossed deserts and a title that did not fit in men's mouths. She heard the letters about Dragonglass and sent back a single clean word. Where? The answer was Dragonstone. The island waited with its black ribs showing and its caves throbbing like hearts made of rock. She came ashore under a sky that was the same blue that had watched Davos kneel, and her face did not change much. But those who knew faces knew she felt the island the way a horse feels the hand that feeds it. She agreed to mine and to arm, and her dragons made the work faster with their heat. They did not like to land on the black glass, but they warmed the stone. Jon went to meet her because it was the kind of thing that might save lives. He stood before a woman who had been across the world and seen it killed in a dozen different ways, and he spoke the way he always spoke, edge first. "I don't care whose seat it is," he said. "If we're dead, dragons burn whites. Dragonglass kills the ones that lead them. That is what matters." She looked at him like he was a story she'd heard and had not liked. Then she said, "I will help." She handed him a spearhead, black as winter, and her hand did not tremble. It was as simple as that, and not simple at all. Winter fell like a house collapsing. The nights grew not only longer but heavier. Snow did not fall so much as select a place and stay. Jon walked the yards of Winterfell with a mind that had nowhere to put its fear. They set pikes around the castle, obsidian heads gleaming in the gray day like eyes. They strung ropes and hung bells from them to wake men who slept too easy. They lined the gods' wood with the longest spears the knappers could chip and the carpenters could socket. They buried jars of pitch and oil in trenches and set a burn wick from the kitchens running between them, a river of fire that would run when it had to. They drew a plan for what they would do when the dead came. Plans are like nets, Jon thought. They catch enough fish that you forgive them their holes. This plan had a god at its center. A boy who had been a boy and was now something else, sat beneath a tree whose face had watched men long enough to know the flavor of their lies. Bran left the world by degrees and returned by others. He looked at Jon with eyes that had seen more than they should and said, "He will come for me. Then we'll be where he comes," Jon said. Arya came to Winterfell as quiet as snowfall. She was shorter than he remembered in his bones and taller than he remembered in his mind. She stood with him on the battlements, and the wind found her hair and harried it. "You arm everyone," she said. "It helps them stand," he said. "Does it help them live?" she asked. "It might," he said, and the way his voice moved on the word might made Arya's mouth bend. She had the dagger at her waist she'd taken from a man who had thought it would never leave his hand. When she pulled it half out, the metal drank what light there was. "Keep that close," Jon said. "Closer than I keep you?" she asked. And for a moment the winter broke, and there was a warmth that had nothing to do with fires. Men came, women came, children came, and old men who had once been strong and were strong again where it mattered. The veil rode in with bronze that shone where it was not tarnished and did not shine where it should not. The Riverlands sent men with hands chapped from work and women who had learned to shoot sitting on milk stools in their yards. The North came with the set faces of people who had nothing left to bargain with except their lives. The Unsullied arrayed themselves where Jon asked, and the Dothraki horses stamped and shook their manes and snorted steam. Dragons scratched at the sky. They gave some men dragonglass blades. They gave more men dragonglass spearheads. They put arrowheads into barrels until the barrels looked like hedgehogs. They found old axes and made new picks and reminded men that fire eats dead meat happily. They posted embermen with torches and slipmen with knives for cutting wicker and rope when things got tangled. They set scouts on the broken road and posted a boy at the bell ropes in the bailey with instructions not to ring until he needed to and to ring like hell when he did. The dead did not arrive as a marching army. They arrived as quiet. The sky went deaf. The air felt like the inside of a glove. Men stopped saying unnecessary words, and unnecessary words are most of human speech. When the bell began to ring, it was as if it had been bound and gagged for a century and had finally wriggled free. The sound hurt and it helped. Positions, John said, and men found the places they had practiced until their boots had made new paths in the snow. Remember, walkers first, then fire. Walkers first. He did not know if saying it again helped. He said it again anyway, like a man fingering a charm. They formed a crescent in front of Winterfell, with trenches waiting to be lit, and beyond that a field sown with caltrops of black glass that would break into more glass if trampled. They lined the walls with archers and put scorpions on the towers, their bolts tipped with obsidian, their sinews drawn tight. In the godswood, Bran sat beneath the face carved into the weirwood, and Theon Greyjoy stood over him with men who had learned to be braver than they had ever been. The face in the tree watched with the unblinking disinterest of stone. The first wights came on all fours. The second wave carried spears that were bones with points. The third had shields taken from men who were now among them. They came without a shout and without a drum and without the tattered remnant of a song. The line held. The line held longer. The line gave where lines always give. In the places where someone slipped and someone else tried to save them, and where the ground had been disturbed by men who had meant well, and where the dead wanted the most. Dragons screamed. Fire spilled where fire had been told to spill. Whites burned, and the smell was like old leather thrown on coals. A white walker, thin as hunger and twice as patient, stalked along the edge of flame and tried to find a seam in the crescent. A boy whose name John had never learned put an arrow through its lung and watched it break, and then put an arrow through its mouth and watched it shatter. The boy laughed like a sob and then died because laughter takes your eyes off what is left. Scorpions. Someone screamed, and the scorpion spoke. Twang, thud, shiver. A bolt took a walker in the pelvis and it came apart like delicate pottery, shards of it hissing in the snow. John felt the relief in his men wick into the ground and realized they had been holding their breath. "Light it," he said, and the trenches went up. A river of fire ran red-orange through the white and put a line between living and dead that was as honest as anything John had ever seen. Whites hurled themselves into the trenches and they burned and they built a bridge. The living shot them as they climbed, but enough climbed. The river of fire did what all rivers do. It was crossed. In the midst of it, a thing happened that no plan can survive and every plan must. A dragon fell. He was not dead. He was wounded, and wounded was a word so large it filled the sky. But he fell, and the force of him hitting the field unmade the work of 100 men. He went down thrashing and screaming, his blood a steam that stung and bewitched, and Ites went for his eyes. His rider leaped clear with a grace no human should have and came away with blood that was not hers. John wanted to run to her. He held his place and thought, not now, not now. Tormund had a walker pinned on a pike like a fish, teeth bared. Ghost leapt and the walker shattered. Tormund threw back his head and shouted something obscene and loving. Ed went down and did not rise, and a man who had never learned his name stepped into his place and used Ed's spear as if it had been made for him. Lyanna Mormont killed a thing that had been a giant and died in its blood, and the sound she made was not the sound of a child. The Riverlands archers shot until their fingers bled, and the bleeding made them warmer, and they were grateful for that small mercy. "Walkers," John said again, stupidly, because the words had become a prayer, and the gods listened to prayers the way rivers listen to men. "Walkers," Arya said at his shoulder, and when John turned, she was there like a thought. "Where?" "Everywhere," he said, and could have laughed. She smiled, sharp. "Good." They began to go down in earnest when men remembered not to slash but to thrust. The obsidian broke if you swung it like iron. It killed if you set it like a nail. Archer lines adapted, shifted like schools of fish. Somewhere to the east, a scorpion crew sang to keep time, and their song was the jaunty kind you sing on the road, and a man beside John cried for a moment because he had not realized he missed roads until he heard the song. The Night King came late. He came when the living were tired in hands and knees and lungs. He came when they had been made to believe, for an instant and no more, that they might outnumber the dead. He rode a dead thing that had once been a dragon, and the air broke around it in a howl like admiration. He dismounted and walked toward the godswood as if it were a place he had left something and had come back to take it up. Fire did not touch him. The snow lay down at his feet and put its face in the ground. Jon went for him, and the world narrowed to that one thing. He felt the drag of all of it. The men he had sent to die and the men he had saved to die later, the letters, the knives, the sound of glass cutting air. He thought of a child's laugh. He thought of Shireen's nose wrinkling when she sounded a hard word. He thought of Arya hitting him and of Sansa not. He went forward with Longclaw in his hands and the obsidian spear slung across his back because he had learned that you carry more than one truth into the world if you can. The Night King lifted his hand and the dead around Jon rose a little more. He did not bother to draw a weapon yet. He had time. He had all the time he would ever need. Jon wanted to scream at him that he did not. That time was a better liar than any man. He swallowed the scream and took another step. In the godswood, Theon held. He held past the point of breaking, and then he broke and held some more. The men beside him were no longer the kind of men they had been, and they were something else instead, bright and brief. Bran opened his eyes and closed them and opened them again. He was somewhere else. He was there. He was a boy whose brother had thrown snow at him, and it had gone down his collar, and he had loved that and hated it at the same time. Arya did not run straight at the Night King because she had learned long ago that running straight at the thing that wants to kill you is a good way to die. She went through the long shadows laid by fire and the shadows laid by things that weren't fire. She moved the way cats do when they go across a fence that would not hold a man. She felt the weight of the dagger at her waist and did not feel it the way you stop feeling your own breath. She saw Jon, and she did not go to him because he did not need her to. There was a ripple in the air near the godswood, and men turned without knowing why. A White Walker's head exploded near the weirwood, and men cheered without knowing who had shot it. The Night King looked toward the sound without haste, because haste was for men who did not know they had one. In that heartbeat, Arya moved. She came at him from his blind side because everything that is a man has a blind side, even if it did not begin as a man. Her feet hardly touched the snow. She was a small thing and his shadow was large, and when she leapt she felt nothing. None of the fear, none of the triumph, none of the stupid noise men make when they get lucky. She went in for the throat because throats are always throats, and his hand came up and caught her by the neck like a father might a child to scold him. The dagger slipped. He lifted her, one hand. He began to squeeze. She dropped. It was not far. She had done worse drops than that in a city where men kept their coin in belts you cut with your teeth. The dagger fell with her this time because she had taught it to do so. She caught it in her other hand. She drove it up into the place between ribs where ribs are closer together. It went in. It was Valyrian steel, and it did what Valyrian steel does. The sound was not a sound. It was the absence of one. It was a taking away. The dead fell like cords cut. The dragon above them shrieked and then shrieked again and then was not shrieking because he had nothing left with which to shriek. The Night King broke like glass thrown onto stone, and the shards of him hissed into the snow and were gone. The storm exhaled. Men lay down because their bodies made them. The living cried because crying is what the body does when it cannot make sense of what it has survived. Jon stood and looked at Arya and was afraid to move, like men are when something larger than them has happened, and to step would be to miss the last of it. She looked back at him and then leaned forward until her forehead touched his breastbone, and he put a hand on the back of her head like he had done when she was smaller and the world had been as simple. As the next day, the fire burned through the night and into the wide, white morning. They counted who had not risen when the dead rose and counted again because counting felt like control. They burned the bodies of those they loved and knew that the gesture did not mean what it had meant before. A thing that kept the dead from being used, not a thing that made them sacred. They ate when food would stay down. They slept and woke and slept. Arya washed her hands until the skin was pink and then left them dirty. Sansa had bread and gave it away and then took someone else's bread and ate it because living is the only honor the living owe the dead. Dragons wheeled overhead. They were smaller in daylight, somehow, and cast thinner shadows. The unsullied tended their wounds with an efficiency that had grief folded into it like flour into dough. Tormund spoke to the children and made a fire for them that he swore would last 100 years, and then it went out in a puff of smoke, and he made another one and declared that was better because the first had been a show-off. Theon's men took their dead aside and did something with their hands that must have been a prayer. Davos sat on a broken bit of crenel and stared at the land as if he could read his life in its lines. Jon stood in the godswood with the weirwood's face above him. Bran sat with the roots wrapped around his legs like a mother's arms. Sansa stood beside them, neat as a stitch. Arya leaned against a tree and watched an ant climb a root like a mountain. The cold was the kind that made your nose run whether you were a lord or a pig boy. "It worked," Sansa said quietly. "All that glass, all those letters, all those ships. It worked today," Jon said. "It will have to work again. But yes, it worked." Arya's smile was a knife laid on velvet. "You armed every house," she said. "I tried," Jon said. "You did," she said. "Even the ones who didn't want it." "Especially those," Sansa murmured. Bran's eyes were far away and near. "He would have come anyway," he said. "I know," Jon said. He put his hand on the bark. The ridges were rough. They felt like the lines on his palm. "We'll tell them," he said. "We'll tell all of them what it took. If they must fight men again, they will have armor that does not break when truth hits it." "You'll tell them," Arya said, pushing off the tree. "I'll just go where I'm pointed." Sansa's hand found Jon's and squeezed. "You will not always have to be the one who sends the letters," she said. "Sometimes other people will write them." He looked at her and the weirwood and the sky. "I hope so," he said. "But I don't mind writing if there's ink." "Then you'd best keep it warm," Davos said behind them. "It's cold as a fishwife's toes out here." He held a thin sheaf of paper in his hand. The top page bore a great greasy thumbprint. The bottom had been splashed with wine. "From the south," he said. "The queen people call Dragon. She says she'll keep the island mines going and send more. They found a seam that runs under the castle itself. Men are afraid to dig it. She says she is not." Jon took the letters and grinned in spite of himself. "Good," he said. "Maybe we'll make jewelry now." "Jewelry, is it?" Davos squinted at Arya's knife. "You fancy a necklace of this stuff?" Arya's laugh was sharp and quick. "I've one piece. It's enough." They were alive, and that meant there was work to do. The dead were still dead, and that meant the living had debts. Jon set men to tallying and lists and the dull courage that comes from organization. He sent ravens again. The words were no prettier and did not wish to be. They said, "We stood with what we made and what we found. We stood because you did not wait to be convinced, and because you demanded to be armed against your doubt. We stood because glass can be a mirror and a blade, and sometimes you need both. There is still food to plant. There are still children to teach to fletch and not cut their fingers. There is still a sea to cross and things to bargain over that are not lives. Send what you can, take what you must, remember what we used, and save a piece for the next time." When he put the last letter into the last raven's little pocket and loosed the bird, the sky was not blue or gray or any color he could name. It was the color of something that had been washed clean and put on a line to dry. The raven went up into it like a thought and vanished. And Jon felt the cold find that space in him it had been leaning on for years and sit down like a friend. "You did it," Davos said. "We did some," Jon said. "We'll do more." "Then eat," Davos said, and pressed a heel of bread into his hand as if he were one of the boys who had cheered when the walkers broke and did not know yet why he had cheered. He ate. It tasted like flour and salt and something else he could not place. A sweetness like an apple left long on a branch and picked in frost. Tasted like living. Beyond the yard, beyond the wall, beyond the maps men had made to make themselves feel bigger, the world turned over, slow as a sleeper. Snow fell in places where it had never fallen and did not stick because the ground would not take it. Fire burned in places where fire had been forbidden, and men warmed their hands at it and forgot they had once thought it wicked. A boy in the Reach bit his tongue napping glass and spit blood and glass flaked together and laughed when his mother hit him lightly on the head. A girl in Dorne slung a knife across her back, not because it was pretty but because she had learned a man is not harmed by what you do not do. At Dragonstone, men carried black glass out of the earth in baskets like fruit. A dragon lay on a ridge and warmed the air and grumbled if anyone came too close to his tail. The queen stood with her hand upon the black rock and thought of her brother and of a house she was rebuilding not from stone but from the memory of what stone had imposed. She said, softly so no one would say she spoke to rock. More. The men brought more. Somewhere, a napper tapped. Push, not force, and the edges sang. And in Winterfell, with the smoke of spent fires folded into its stones, Sansa sat at a table with a piece of black glass to hold down the papers when the wind came under the door. She read letters and answered some, and the ones she did not answer she put aside for Jon, because there were things he could say that no one else could. Arya sharpened her dagger and said nothing, and the nothing said a great deal. Bran breathed slowly like an old tree and woke into small flights of birds that did nothing more than be birds, because that was a better way of remembering how to be a boy. Jon stood on the battlements with Ghost at his side. The wolf's fur caught the light and threw it back the way snow does, with a softness that is not gentle. Men in the yard below trained with spears tipped in black, thrusting, not slashing, bringing the heads back to their faces to see the chips, measuring the nappers' work with their hands. A child with a braid stood behind them and copied poorly and stuck her tongue out with concentration. The worst of the winter? Ed would have asked had he been there. Jon would have said something stupid and kind, and both would have known better. He swallowed and let the wind take the words he had and make them something else. He had broken the most stubborn habit of the North, the habit of not believing until the grave was already dug. He had broken it with letters and with glass and with the simple task of telling men what needed doing and how. It felt less like victory than like breath. Annoying to be reminded of, impossible without which to live. Perhaps that was all leadership was, giving people the tools to do what they feared they could not. Perhaps it was less glorious and more patient than the songs would stand to sing. Ghost nosed his hand. The wolf's nose was cold. It belonged to the living. Jon put his palm on the wolf's skull and felt it press back, as if saying, "Do not forget this." "I will not," he answered, in the way men answer wolves. By standing. He left the battlements and went down into the day. He walked the yard, where the smith measured sockets, and the napper taught pushing not forcing, and the baker burned the bottoms of loaves and made jokes at his own expense. He walked where the letters were written and not warmed overmuch by the candle because parchment refuses to sweat. He walked into the godswood and stood before the tree whose face seemed softer when the light hit it from the side. He told it nothing, and it told him everything in the way trees always do. Slowly, without caring whether you listen. When he came back to the hall, Sansa pushed a letter across the table. "There's grain coming," she said, "and more glass, and one lord from the south who says we owe him thanks. We'll send him some," Jon said. He reached into the basket. There were letters there too from men he did not know, and boys he would never meet, and women who had made knives their fathers would never understand. He put those aside to answer tonight. He would answer them one by one, and the answers would be short and useless to the reader of songs and exactly what they had been waiting to hear. Outside, the wind eased and shifted, and the smoke from the pyres that had burned for days had finally thinned to tendrils and then strands and then nothing at all. The snow did not stop. It would never stop entirely, not here. This was the north. But it fell in smaller flakes now, less like a command and more like a reminder. He watched it through the narrow slit of a window as he took up the quill. He pressed it to parchment and wrote. There are days he might remember later as greater. The day the storm broke and the night broke with it. The day the dead stayed dead. The day Arya did what only Arya could. But this too mattered. The day after, when men sharpened and women counted and a wolf pressed its head into a man's palm and the man lifted his hand and did not let it fall. The day when letters went out full of what to do and how to do it, because instructions are a kind of mercy. Jon wrote until the candle bent and the quill's nib split and the ink froze, and he warmed it in his hands and did not complain. He wrote until the light outside tilted toward a kind of blue that promises darkness and keeps its promises. He wrote while the wind spoke in the way of wind, and the house that had held and broken him held still. He wrote, and when he had no more words he stood and went out to see that the spears were stacked right, and the trenches covered, and the boys asleep, and the guards awake. He breathed in the cold, and found in it the ghost of something like gratitude. He had made something of a world that believed it could not be made. He had done it with glass and with letters and with a kind of stubbornness that was not a virtue until it saved you. He lifted his face into the snow and let it fall on his lashes and did not blink right away. Then he went back inside, because the living belonged there, because there was more work, because there always is,